In this video, I want to talk about how mixing with a lot of plugins is actually better sometimes, and that more is actually more. There's this weird dichotomy in the mixer world in the audio industry to where less is more is seen as a really, really good thing, which it can be, but more being more is seen as like, okay, you just don't know what you're doing. You're slapping on a bunch of nonsense for no reason. When I don't think that's the case. And I think that there's a thing in the middle that exists to where there's a more of less approach. Let me explain. So usually what happens, why people think this whole less is more thing is so appealing is because people, they put on plugins and processing that they don't really actually know about, and they just start stacking crap trying to fix all of these issues that they're now creating with all of these plugins and all of this stuff. And you just go down into the mixing spiral of death and everything just sounds really bad. So what happens when you have that more is more approach in a pretty unhinged and cooked scenario, you overcompensate and you over course correct to this less is more thing to where you're like, oh, I'm just not gonna touch it. Hey, and sometimes that actually is the move. Sometimes that's the move. But I think there is a balance. Like all things in life, there is a balance. And there's a thing in the middle to where once you know your tools, and once you know exactly what you want those tools to do, you can have 10 plugins on a chain, and maybe each one is doing a tiny, tiny little thing very specifically and very methodically that you wouldn't have been able to do if you just, were on the other side of the fence and you just stacked a bunch of plugins thinking, oh, doing more is gonna get me more. But again, there's a more of less approach. So each plugin is doing less, but you have more of that less. For instance, maybe you have like on a vocal and you have 10 plugins on this vocal and you have your bass line EQ before a compressor, so the compressor reacts appropriately, but when the compressor reacts, it brings up these S's, so you do one line of de-essing that targets one specific type of S's, and then you do another dynamic EQ to target the rest that isn't, maybe those S's aren't actually that offending and it's the frequency of those S's that's the offending, so now you do that, and then you do another compressor to tuck down the peaks, and then you put a little bit of soothe before another compressor to then get the overall tone and to get it. You see what I'm saying here? If you're doing each one of these things methodically and you're doing each one of these things in order of operations with a plan of attack, that's the key, a plan of attack, more can actually be more. Because now you're leveraging all of these tools that you have in your toolbox. You're leveraging all the knowledge that you've gained by screwing up sound sources over the years. I mean, you got to put your reps in to know what your tools do and how not to push them, to know when to pull them out. And maybe, hey, I'm just going to bring in soothe just to do the mix at maybe 20% on just this little tiny region on a vocal. And maybe that's all it needs. From soothe, you don't need to soothe the whole vocal at 100% with a bunch of intensity on it and a bunch of, the depth turned all the way up or whatever. Sometimes you don't need to do that, but sometimes you do. And who cares if you do? Does it sound good? Ultimately, this entire stigma for me just comes from a place of, does it actually sound good? The real reason I'm making this video is because I feel that in the industry, there's this pervasive thing in the zeitgeist to where people are just, they look down on how much you're doing, on what plugins you're using in what scenario. And it's like, you don't even know what the sound source sounded like before. And if it sounds good now, you should not care. And that's what I'm trying to tell you, is regardless of whatever you are doing, who cares if you put 1 million plugins on the sound source? Does it sound good? If it sounds good, it is good. That's our job, is to make it sound good. Who cares if you put 10 plugins on the vocal? Who cares if you have 10 plugins on your guitar master bus? Who freaking cares? Your listener isn't gonna care. Your listener's not gonna be like, oh, wow, I can totally hear how he used 10 plugins on this bus. Dude, nobody's gonna care. All it is an ego thing, feeling like, oh, I put so much on this, so if I'm putting so much on this, I'm doing the most. And if I'm doing the most, it's because I don't know how to do the most with a little bit. But my argument is maybe you know how to do the most with the most, because in those most, like the 10 plugins that you might be using, you're doing a little, tiny, hardly anything, a little. And all of those little tiny things create one big picture that you just wouldn't be able to get with 2 plugins. There's no way. On the flip side of that, sure, maybe you are doing too much and you're just completely cooking a sound source. If that's you, you need to stop. You need to stop. This video is not for you. This video is for people who have been down that path, who have cooked mixes and completely bastardized sound sources, and now you're scared to do that again. But you know your tools now. Now you know your tools. Don't let other peers, don't let other people who are looking over you look at your EQs and the type of things that you're doing if it sounds good, and then having them tell you that what you're doing is wrong. This will happen to me a lot. People will look at what I put on my master bus sometimes. They'll be like, oh, he put Gullfoss, mix head, and God particle on the mix bus. Wow, he's using every single plugin that, wannabe mixers are using on their mix bus. It's like, you don't know how I'm using it. I'm using it at like 5%. Each one of these things is doing a very specific job. And that's all that matters, is if you have a very specific methodical job for your tools in mind, when you're applying them, you're good. If your client's happy, you're good. And if you're happy, well, hopefully you'll be good if you're happy. At least that, right? I hope that this little rant helps you to, not be afraid to use more processing than maybe you're used to, but in less amounts. Maybe you're opening Pro Q3 just to have one band of dynamic EQ. That's okay. That's totally okay. Maybe you want the shelf from a Pultec at like 1.5 dB on a vocal. That's okay. You don't need to go crazy with it. Maybe the next thing you want is Pro MB and you're just using a little tiny bit at 200 hertz to shave out some of the boominess whenever it crosses the threshold. If that's what you gotta do, that's what you gotta do. You don't have to feel like you have to use the full extent of every single plugin and every single tool. That's the beauty of digital, is you have all of this leeway to do a bunch of things that don't have to be crazy big. They can all be small, little tiny increments. And I promise you, that will make a big difference. It will make a big picture. Just make sure not to get lost down the mixing rabbit hole, and then you end up in the dark side of mixing and your ears are cooked and your mix is cooked. So always maintain that perspective. If you found this video helpful, here's another video where I rant about why mixing is actually important and how a lot of people don't give mixing the importance and the credit it really deserves, and how a song is positioned in the ears and the mind of a listener. So go check that out. Peace.